Architecture Planning and Preservation, the second lecture in the lectures that are sponsored by the Keibel Gallery. I think most of you know me, but for those who don't, my name is Renee Eisenbach. I'm a member of the architecture faculty and I'm chair of the Keibel Gallery. It's my pleasure today to welcome Nader Tehrani, head of MIT's Department of Architecture and principal of Nader, to deliver the Keibel lecture this evening and to celebrate the opening of the exhibition of the firm's work, Catalytic Structures, Transform Types. Tonight's lecture will be followed by a reception sponsored by the Keibel family, and I want to thank Marcus King, who's continued the tradition of assistance from NOMAS. He is the president of NOMAS this year. For those individuals interested in continuing education credit, there's a sign-up sheet along the left wall. Before I introduce Professor Tehrani, I'd like to thank the many people who have contributed to creating this wonderful exhibition. The Keibel family, the University of Maryland School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, and the principals of Nader, Nader Tehrani, Catherine Faulkner, and Dan Gallagher, for their support and for the support of the entire Nader team. I know that I speak not only for myself, but also for my colleagues as well, in thanking our alumna, Lisa Lasciarite-Lastrido, for her incredible work in assembling, curating, and installing the exhibition. She was assisted in the Nader office by David Richmond, Mark McDowell, Nora Al-Musallam, and John Hauser, as well as other members of the Nader firm who worked on the images in the exhibition. On the Maryland side, I'd like to offer our deep appreciation to Sophie Weller, Keibel Gallery assistant, who did a tremendous job heading up our team, and to Tom Swift, the Fab Lab director. They were assisted by the Fab Lab GAs, Xavier Hickerson, Tim McCartney, Valerie Sherry, and Erica Thornton. And I'd like to also thank the Linear Gallery directors, Lubna Chowdhury and Natalia Dikinoff, as this was a shared effort, and this exhibition is both in the Keibel Gallery and the Linear Gallery. Before I offer you a list of Nader's accomplishments, I'd like to begin with a personal note, a personal reflection. Nader and I were undergraduates together at RISD. I guess we've reached the age where I'll no longer say how many years it has been since we first met as sophomores in our first year of architecture school. Suffice it to say that I'm shocked by how many years ago that is. In architecture school, friendships often develop by proximity. One tends to befriend the people who sit near you in studio, and upon graduation, our paths cross and crisscross, sometimes more often, sometimes less often. It has given me great pleasure over the years to watch the work of my peers develop and flourish, and to see the different paths they have taken since their education at RISD. It probably comes as no surprise that as a student in a culture already infused with a deep passion for architecture and design, late-night charrettes, creativity and rigor, Nader's work stood out, and Nader stood out. It is clear from the office's work today, which many students and my peers look to, that passion and rigor continues to drive it forward. My pleasure today is doubled. For one of our students, Lisa Lasciarite, was hired by Nader to work in his office soon after her graduation from UMD in 2009. And she has been the project coordinator for the House for Southern France that is on display in the Keibel Gallery. How do architecture ideas and culture develop? It emerges both from the exploration of precedent and dialogue with the artifact, with architecture of the past and architects of the past and present, but also through the proximity of individuals, through the opportunity to sit next to someone else, to engage in dialogue, and someone else who has much to teach when you have much to learn. The idea for this exhibition came after I heard Nader lecture at Catholic University this summer. The focus was on 3 architecture schools that were in the office. It seemed like a perfect time to host this work and to invite Nader to speak. It is a time when our program is revisiting our own architecture curriculum and thinking about where we wish to go in the future. The hope is the exhibit and the talk will serve as another catalyst for us to advance our thinking. You'll hear about this work today, and the projects of the architecture schools are on exhibit in the linear gallery. Nader and his office were also keen to have the opportunity to discuss and reflect upon two recent houses. Those are on exhibit in the Keibel Gallery. Nader Tehrani is a professor and head of the Department of Architecture at MIT. He is also principal of Nader, a practice dedicated to the advancement of design innovation, interdisciplinary collaboration, and an intensive dialogue with the construction industry. As the principal and founder of Office Da, Tehrani's work has been recognized with notable awards, including the Cooper Hewitt National Design Award in Architecture, the United States Artist Fellowship in Architecture and Design, and the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Architecture. He has also received the Harleston Parker Award for the Northeastern University Multi-Faith Spiritual Center and the Hobson Award for the Georgia Institute of Technology Hinman Research Building. Throughout his career, Tehrani has received 14 Progressive Architecture Awards, as well as numerous AIA, Boston Society of Architects, and ID Awards. Recently, Nader was named #1 in design by Architect Magazine Top 50 Design Awards. Tehrani has lectured widely at institutions including the Guggenheim Museum in New York, Harvard University, Princeton University, and the Architectural Association. He has participated in many symposia, including the Monterey Design Conference, the Buell Center Contemporary Architecture and Its Consequence at Columbia University, and the Graduate School of Design Beyond the Harvard Box. The works of Nader Tehrani have been widely exhibited at MoMA, LA MoCA, and ICA Boston. His work is also part of the permanent collection of the Canadian Center for Architecture and the Nasher Sculpture Center. He has served as the principal in charge of a variety of projects in different arenas, in digital fabrication, institutional projects of complex programmatic order, and residential projects of large and small scale. Having won the commissions of 3 schools of architecture, Tehrani has completed the Hinman Research Building at the Georgia Institute of Technology and is currently working on completion of the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning at the University of Melbourne, and the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design at the University of Toronto. Please help me welcome Nader Tehrani.
Thank you, Randy. I'm going to betray you and let them know that I just turned 50, so you must be not far behind. Sadly, the older you get, it doesn't mean that your life changes that much. And luckily, I have Lisa to thank for charretting with me and keeping the energy of the office and some of these projects. The projects have gotten bigger, they've gotten more complex, but actually what we've tried to do is to keep them thematically quite focused. Only Rahid knows that the curriculum at RISD, being a school of art, was quite interdisciplinary from the point of view of the arts. But in fact, somehow studies that had to do with environmental systems, structural systems, got thrown under the bus. I am one of those students who till today cannot get registered because I just can't pass those exams. So this lecture in many ways is a sublimation of that effort into a thesis about the role of structures and the way in which they can impact material thinking, spatial thinking, and typological thinking, and in a way reorder, if you like, paradigmatically, how we think of architecture. In a nutshell, that is what this lecture is about. As a preamble, I have to say that some of the early work was instrumental to thinking this through, but almost at the level of the DNA. At that time, this is now 20 years ago, I had never imagined that this is the lecture I was working myself towards. But at that moment, I was focused on what the role of materials are in architecture in a world, in a theoretical context where, on the one hand, history and typology had the upper hand in one camp, and deconstruction and the theoretical edifice of structuralism and post-structuralism was attempting to dismantle it. the role of the building industry, is this getting fuzzy or not?
Yeah, it doesn't sound.
Let me try this. Is this better?
Is that better?
Is that better? No fuzzy? The role of the building industry and construction really did not contribute to that thing which I think we should be doing. So part of my effort was to theorize the building industry on the one hand, and on the other was to bring the building industry back into the academy as a platform for speculation. Here, the Zahedi House, which is actually a renovation, an extension of the building into a second floor, we adopted a new skin system, corrugated copper to be specific, and we were researching its material properties. We discovered that it is quite structural on the vertical axis, but in fact quite malleable on the horizontal axis. And by becoming almost what is a ruled, technically what's called a ruled surface, we could create an awning condition connecting the living room to the garden, inserting the stair inside, and essentially embedding it within the depth of the skin. What is interesting for me in reflecting on this is that in architecture, drawing is not a pictorial act. It is already an act of construction. And in a way, that's why it's important to recognize that the line on top is exactly the same length as the line on the bottom, and that you can develop that surface by unrolling it is already a proof of the theorem, even before you get into the constructive moment. Now, at around the same time, we did an exercise for Casa La Roca, which began to tempt structure not merely at the surfacial level, but at a structural level. Working within the model that you're also familiar with, the serpentine wall at UVA and some of the walls of El Ade Dieste, we wanted to develop a bonding system that is neither a running bond nor a Flemish bond, but taking the bonding system as a kind of expandable system, we realized that we don't need to cut any brick to make this wall. We can make a single white brick wall laterally braced by merely expanding and contracting the voids within that brick and then rotating them on the diagonal to produce a joinery that produces, again, a corbelled ruled surface that gives depth to that wall and then lateral stability. Now, what's important for me on this project was also, even though we were conceptualizing this as a structural system, was that it expanded its domain by the introduction of air and light. In other words, it was a kind of, it had a surfacial beginning, but it began to expand into an environment, into the porch, which was so central to that project. Now, these are not linear in sequence, but I'm trying to build a narrative for you. Some years later, I was traveling in Japan, absolutely fascinated by the Togs, Ito's Togs, imagining not only that the building has a powerful iconographic connection to the nature in front of it, but also that it may define a new spatial paradigm. For those of you that know the building, you know that you're left a little bit dry when you go on the inside, because effectively it is a classic modern building, leading you to believe that it is no more operating within the paradigm of the duck and the decorated shed. That the organizational and configurative system of the tree yields nothing in the transformation of the building. So the question really was how we would adopt literally that building as a platform for its transformation. And we got just the right project to do so. We were shortlisted for an important competition on the campus at AUB. 4 young architects with one very big architect who eventually won the competition. And because we were sure that she was going to win that competition, we realized that this is actually a great moment to do an academic exercise. This was not the project that we would try to win. This is not the project that you would try to be responsible with. This is the project that you would try to complete the incomplete project of another architect. And so I didn't call Ito, but essentially started with his project as the point of departure. So we knew from the beginning of this project that given the site of our project in a kind of embedded bosque of trees, that our building was not going to speak to the urbanism and the architecture of the campus, but rather dissolve itself into the branches of this nature. What our task then was to develop a system that could generate both an organizational structure, a spatial structure, and a way to blend the relationship between the inside and the outside of the building. To do that, we started with a DNA. A geometry of a hexagon, once truncated, can become triangulated to make a column. Once expanded, it can produce the conditions for a pilotis. Once rotated, it can transfer loads from one condition to the other, or be flattened simply into a ball system. The notion that a geometric seed, which is different than a concrete block per se, becomes in a way a constellation of forces that can essentially be compacted and thick at the bottom, spatializing itself, transfer loads in the middle, and effectively lighten up at the top and develop a system of branches that holds up some of the lighter aspects of the building. Following the modern paradigm, one can begin essentially with a simple tray-based structure for large volumes like auditoria, create transfer beams. For cantilevers, essentially the same thing in relationship to the bosque of trees. And then the configuration of the structure begins to stretch and split in a binary way as it goes to the top. The building essentially becomes an index for the transformation of the structural system. Here, effectively a courtyard at the top of the building, describing the spatial mesh in which the building is embedded. And of course, on the outside of the building, the idea that structure and skin envelope becomes part of its iconographic agenda. That structure here has now become part and parcel of the redefinition of the type. Now, obviously there's much more to this building as with the other buildings, but it forms a kind of prologue to the 3 schools of architecture that have become so central to our preoccupation over the last few years. Schools of architecture. On the left, in Sao Paulo, a space much like yours, in fact, alerts us to the idea that the flexibility of a central hall is not merely there to serve purposes, but is a public space. The idea that that a school of architecture is, I don't know, a place of manifestation, a place of occupation, is actually very important. The GSD, very close to some of us, the idea that a school of architecture is a factory. It's a place of production. And particularly in the case of the GSD is the idea that, unlike MIT, where studios are compartmentalized in different locked quarters, that the studio is one room, not 2 rooms, 1 room, accessible, everybody is visible to everybody. You're there to see and be seen. A very important aspect of learning, what Ronit was saying earlier on. The majority of the learning and teaching we did at RISD was from each other. not to discredit the professors, but really it had to do with what happened, you know, starting at 9 p.m. and going to 4 in the morning. The third image, Koolhaas's rather clever addition to Cornell University, a wink to the current condition. A great addition, and again, a big working factory, but in fact is occurring at a moment in time where we are being challenged by very stringent conditions of the economy, important moment in the depletion of resources worldwide, the limited resources we have in architecture schools. Space is becoming an important commodity, and moreover than anything, we don't draft in the same way we used to before. We take our laptops everywhere. I saw people with laptops working in this room as they are. I hope they're working on their projects. We design everywhere. We design at Starbucks, we design in the lobby, we design in the auditorium. So the sacred status of the studio space has been transformed to many other functions, as a space of scholarship, a space of socialization, a space of anything, but on top of it, the studio space. So what does it mean in an era of the digital revolution, in an era of online education, where we begin to reconceptualize the design studio altogether? These are important distinctions from where architecture was just 30 years ago when we were in school. Now, in the context of all of this, I can't somehow get over the Rudolph building at Yale, because it is the ultimate integrated building. It's a kind of Gesamtkunstwerk of all architecture schools, where notions of light, of centrality, of the social space of criticism, this is one of the only pedagogies that exist in the world where faculty and students are almost absolutely equal in relationship to each other, because it's the discursive space of debate that becomes the space of education. And that building somehow manifests in different tiers: the auditorium, the exhibit space, the library, the crit space, and in the studios, bringing the light from above, where all of this is brought together. And the quest somehow for integration and synthesis is consistently at work within the body of our work. At Georgia Tech, we inherited a building, the Hinman building, and it is an extraordinary piece of architecture. Designed by Heffernan some over half a century ago, the building has certain salient qualities that makes this maybe not just a project of restoration and preservation, because we couldn't fit all of the program within it, but it makes it a dance with the existing building. Now, we've seen strategies of engagement with buildings that are exemplary. I always bring up Scarpa because the way in which he operates in Verona and Castelvecchio is quite sensitive but significant. He constructs an opposition between the existing and the new, and in so kind of develops a game of box. What we do, in fact, is quite the opposite. We play judo with the existing building. In other words, we work with its existing and latent forces and drag it in our own way. I will show you that in a second. But first, urbanistically, the recognition also that the School of Architecture at Georgia Tech is 3 or 4 different buildings, and various functions are distributed between them. This is simply the new wing that is going to help to connect the main quad to a working quad in the back, using the high bay of the existing building as a massive factory, a studio space, that brings all of the elements of this campus together, making the quad and this interior part of a public continuum. Now, as I was saying earlier on, the studio, as you well know, is at the heart and the soul of the School of Architecture. It is composed of elements that need to work with it. The idea of the basic support that one needs, printers and a shop. The notion that the studio space is not merely a place of production, but is a place of research, where libraries and laboratories may get integrated into it, in the studio of the future, where culture becomes part of it. What happens when you don't segregate lecture halls from the studio space? What happens when you lecture in the studio space itself? and the space that starts after hours, where cafes, movies, and other things happen when the faculty are gone. This is the conception that we had in treating the high bay at Georgia Tech. It was with the acknowledgement that the parallel rule no longer exists, and the way that we work and the way that we store is just different. So we needed a new way of conceptualizing flexibility while accommodating for the differences of pedagogy in one space. The big question, what are we going to do in this incredible space that was given to us? A huge factory space where amazing research on helicopters and many other technologies were developed through the 20th century. And you know, it reminded us of the Tate, where extraordinarily different exhibitions were able to manipulate that space as a public space, as a piece of urbanism, as a space of phenomena, and that our space too could become such a significant anchor for the campus. But being also submitted to a formidable amount of programming that we realized that we actually have to occupy it. So after a massive struggle with the university, we realized that we had this high bay, and now we have to just stuff it like a piece of taxidermy. Luckily, the economic gloom and doom happened at that moment, and the budget was cut. And so the value engineering process helped us to reduce the program, yet not kill the building. And so in fact, within this process, we realized that the high bay can remain intact, but now we have to think of it strategically in terms of what it can do for us. We realized right then and there that what was important about the ground was its flexibility. Yes, we could lift the ground up to wire it and put all of the technologies on it, but that there was a great asset in the truss and the crane that was on the roof, because that's where everything could hang from. And so the project was really born out of this tension of flexibility defined on the vertical axis versus the curricular flexibility connecting the studio spaces with exhibit spaces, fab labs, PhD spaces, and so forth, connecting it socially on the horizontal. And really, the building was in a way born out of the repurposing of that existing crane, locking it into space and literally suspending the new visiting critic studio on top of it, where this tray is suspended in midair. The ground is flexible. It has desks, but they can be moved, they're on wheels, and they constantly get reshifted in many configurations. The roof is the piece of infrastructure that informs the space. The crib, what we call it, is really the suspended element with one stair that kind of comes down only at one point, lands on a desk actually, it doesn't even touch the ground. And then on the southern wing, a new spiral stair that connects and activates the southern edge of the building, creating a kind of continuous circulation loop. And finally, the lighting that hangs low during the workspace hours, but when you're making large installations of 30, 40 feet tall, are brought up to make the high bay an actually functional space once again. And then here, the lateral flexibility that is given in connecting the factory to the fab labs, the exhibit rooms, the PhD research spaces, and the other studio spaces makes this a kind of interdisciplinary space where everything comes together. I'm sorry, I apologize, I don't have the images of how this is being used, but in fact, the Beaux-Arts Ball has occurred there, the exhibitions have happened there, crits happen there, cinema happens there, graduation happens there. So I suspect that your own high bay has had many events like that. But keeping true to the idea of suspension, everything is also suspended within that space. The guillotine wall that you see in the distance there is a 60-foot wall that separates the gallery from the main space and just drops down. The spiral stair is an off-the-shelf element that is shrink-wrapped with a kind of extend mesh fabric, kind of as a kind of tensile structure that is suspended from one of the cords of the truss. The grid, as you see there, unfolds the steel flanges of the structure to produce a stair that lands on a collective table. And of course, the assembly of all of these pieces in relationship to custom fluorescent lighting that we drop in place that get plucked up when needed. And it's amazing actually as a building because it's truly rough. It's a rough piece of industrial architecture, though it was really pleasurable to see huge thugs weaving this thing very delicately and crafting it like really a beautiful piece of architectural work. But it maintains a kind of delicate balance between a finessed piece of works, some in steel, some in concrete, some in wood, extending the legacy of Heffernan, grafting it forth, but distinguishing it from the existing building in significant ways. Connecting it urbanistically to the rest of the campus for the first time in 40 years, opening up the door from the third level, opening up the view into the space on the western side, and then having a garage door that opens up into the back court and literally extending the courtyard back into the space. Not accidentally, the building had an existing sign. It said research. The only thing we did to that sign is that we buffed down the ARCH at the end to kind of index the transition from a research building into a school of architecture. At the time that we were doing Georgia Tech, the economy was at its lowest. We did about 14 competitions in less than a year and a half. We were lucky enough to win 4 out of those 14, and that became the basis for our survival over these last 3 or 4 years. The first one of which was Melbourne Uni, an international competition that we were lucky enough that 3 days before, a 2-phase competition, 3 days before the deadline, John Wardle of John Wardle Architects picked up the phone and called me and said, you know, would you be willing to enter this competition with us? And you know, I had just been to Australia the year before that. I had actually gotten a tour of some of his buildings without him, by somebody else, and was absolutely captivated by the symmetry and the similarity between their work and ours. There was clearly something conceptual within both of our works that had a parallel track. Albeit they had completed at least a few dozen buildings and had a sophistication of experience that we had never achieved. I jumped on the opportunity and I said, absolutely we will. And I didn't know what the ecology of the competition was, but that was to become clear in some months later. So in 3 days, we did make that first submission and were shortlisted with a team of 4 others for the actual competition, which we subsequently won, with a very bad project, but a project that addressed the conceptual points of the dean in very succinct ways. I mean, this is the first time I would say that a competition has been won not through the design of a building, but the design of episodes that do not hold together, but are absolutely specific to the cause of the redefinition of an institution of architecture. Now, in Australia, Melbourne Uni is the other side of the coin to RMIT. RMIT is the design school, and Melbourne Uni is the research school. And yet, never having had a space for design, a design studio, they wanted to test out what does it mean to give a space of design for this expanding school. Over 2,000 students, that was an incredibly difficult feat. And I have to say, very frustrating for me that after many, many schemes, that the very program that we sought to instill for them was not affordable. So there is no studio space in the building I'm about to show you. no dedicated studio space. Studio space at Melbourne Uni is a classroom space that is scheduled from 9 to 1 and then from 2 to 6 and then from 7 to 11. It's a revolving space, which means that the studio space of this building happens all in the interstitial spaces outside of the dedicated spaces. And that is one of the difficult challenges. There are many issues about this project, but suffice it to say that this is a building right in the center off of what is called the concrete lawn right above me here, that is in the round. There is no front and there is no back. But part of the critical agenda of this building was to make it urbanistically integrated into the rest of the campus, drawing in the disciplines from all over the campus into it, and actually exposing the functions of architecture, educating people about architecture, but also giving up our programs to their use. One of the agendas was to bring Masson Road on the south from Swanston, the main artery into the campus, and connect it back into the building. To produce a new court on the west to what they call the Lizzie Murdoch building. This is the famous Murdoch, the mother of the famous Murdoch, and puncture it through the building, producing a new promenade through the building. A connection between the main central space of the building back into the northwest edge, a cafe and an alleyway that connects it back to Swanston. The service area to the northwest, a kind of Fab Lab court to the north, and of course the concrete lawn, the main public space that connects the building to the student center opposing it on the other side, at the core, at the heart of the campus. The School of Architecture and Planning and Landscape and Building Construction is what defines the heart of Melbourne Uni. Extending the urbanistic logic and the Georgian courts of the school was a way of acknowledging that our building is a mat building. It's a very deep building without any possibility of light in the center until you begin to excavate it. So essentially a covered court, an interior space was created with filtered light that brought together the various elements of this building. A place in section with a piano nobile, a new ground plane that is above the ground, engages an existing building, the Joseph Reed facade, the new circulation, a vitrine against the Lizzie Murdoch building, and then finally a ceiling, a kind of coffering of light from which, very much like Georgia Tech, is suspended the visiting critic studio, a kind of iconic element that brings together some of the key elements of this project. The building of this new ground was essential to it, because essentially what we wanted to create was a street that runs through the building, accessible 24/7, and exposing the unique functions of a school of architecture to the rest of the campus. The spaces of research on the left, the library, the exhibition hall, the Fab Labs, the cafe, all of those things that basically bring architectural culture to the fore. And then this piano nobile that produces this new ground. This new ground is that internal plaza, the ground for this atrium, above which the visiting critic studio is suspended. The ground essentially informs a kind of unit, a unit that grows up to become the locker systems, where all of those students who don't have a dedicated desk have places to store their material. This locker system becomes the envelope, a spatial system for a classroom underneath, an experimental classroom, but also a bleacher system, an outdoor classroom open to the atrium, which anchors one corner of this space. The circulatory system that envelops this, in fact, is not a corridor. It's a widened system which is then occupied with permanent pieces of furniture that begin to define programmatic possibilities that would otherwise be succumbing to simply circulation space. This ceiling is a structural ceiling. It is all made out of laminar glue-bound beams, bringing in southern light. Southern light for them is northern light for us, from which is suspended the visiting critic's studio. The idea of this was to transform the monolithic, thick, and structural system of this coffered ceiling into a form of suspension. That form of suspension essentially takes the thick wood and begins to create a veneer system out of it as it goes down. What is deep and monolithic yields to a thin veneer system as it hangs down to the bottom. Essentially a glue lamp system that transforms itself into a thin plywood system. The perimeter of which extends the kind of millwork logic of the space. The space underneath the visiting critic studio does not touch the ground. It is literally suspended. The coffering underneath it has acoustic baffles, sprinkler systems, and lighting systems that produces a kind of microenvironment that is yet open to the space of the atrium below. It's a living room, it's a lecture hall, it's an open space where everything happens. The connection of the coffering at the top defines the depth and the thickness of that entire system as it comes together and begins to produce a form of entasis, a buckling of that roof literally at the center as it hangs down. Flanking this is what we call the Y-stair, a kind of continuous loop of circulation that constantly splits into two so it activates both wings of the atrium. Here you see the construction of that Y-stair literally hot off the press just last night. And then a stacked series of terraces which then acquire a variable depth to them, where different programs are amassed to produce the life and essentially the body of what I call the studio space of this building. This is all the borrowed space along these flanges of this perimeter. The ground, of course, is the public plaza. The second deck is conference tables, collaboration spaces that look out over onto that plaza. The next space, counter spaces that extend the spaces of the studio and classrooms with seats that look back onto it. And then on the top, next to the PhD spaces, benches that look back onto crit spaces that extend the logic of these spaces into the depth of the building. And thus, each of these spaces produce a kind of a zone of pedagogy that keeps recalibrating the depth of this building, taking what would be a classic donut organization and testing its frayed edges to become appropriatable by the student body. In a way, transforming spaces of scheduled dedication into spaces of appropriation. Now, having just seen the completion of the Media Lab at MIT, a beautiful and arguably sophisticated building, but unfortunately a perfect jewel, we were also very conscious of the necessary roughness of what an architecture school needs to be. We see the School of Architecture as a piece of infrastructure that the students transform. It should precisely not be too finished. So we wanted to produce a structural shell of concrete, and the precast industry of Australia is fantastic. But also working with a ply system of wood, produce formwork that becomes embedded in the existing building and stays there as part of the natural resource of the building. So in fact, this is a wood building that is built up 5 stories with the formwork that becomes permanently embedded in the building. And then the skin of the building becomes a variable louvered system that engages with the northern, eastern, and western light in different calibrated ways as it navigates itself around the building. With the southern exposure exposing the raw concrete of that structure. Ironically, we had to inherit not a building, but a facade, the Joseph Reed facade, from 50 years ago on the site. This building was never on the site. It was a bank in downtown Melbourne and was transported here because of some kind of donation to preserve it, and never had a building behind it that corresponded to its syntax, its organization. This also became an opportunity that for the first time in history to frame the importance of this structure. It is actually a very beautiful piece of classicism, but also establish porosities between the inside and the outside and a meaningful engagement with that facade. So in fact, one of the things that we were able to do is to develop a line of thinking for it. One, a way of framing it, documenting it, understanding its depth. Two, developing a structural system that would buttress it to keep it in place. Cladding it from the inside, registering its apertures, its openings, its windows. But then for the first time, engaging it, penetrating those windows, and targeting views out into the plaza, but also extending two of those windows as a kind of studio crit space that engages back into the circular solar system and erecting it from that facade. The transformation of that facade then was not merely an act of respect on the building, but the kind of responsibility to be able to transform a piece of infrastructure into something it had never been. A kind of riff on the crane system of Georgia Tech. Thus, the structuring of the ground into a mound, the structuring of the roof as a span into the studio, and the structuring of the facade as a kind of infrastructure for the cantilever all become a kind of reflection on the possibility that the structural forces of these buildings become an avenue, an excuse, an alibi for programmatic interventions. Now the last building, at the University of Toronto, again the last competition we won, in fact we won the competition for a building that is over here. And through a range of negotiations with the provost, the president, and all of that, they realized that it doesn't make sense to expand that building. And they offered us the space of Spadina Circle, an existing neo-Victorian building, neo-Gothic building of the Victorian era, to recycle, repurpose, and reinvent an urbanism in the southwestern corner of the UT campus, to give it a new life. And therefore this project, all of a sudden, for the Daniel School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape, becomes this incredible opportunity to reflect on the design disciplines as an organic and larger conception. It's not just a building of architecture, but really a building of landscape. The existing building has an interesting existing morphology, a kind of U-shaped building, but over a long period has a series of aggregations of additions and so forth that have become added onto the northern side. This is a monumental building that on Spadina has this incredible presence on the south facade, but a kind of village-like series of structures on the north. So part of our strategy was really to readapt, if you like, misadapt the building, using the existing circulatory system that ends in two pavilions, invading it, if you like, but completing what will be a new court for it. Completing the building then enables it to get a new facade on the north, for the first time gaining a kind of presence according to Spadina North, anchoring the building with cores on the two upper sides. In doing so, producing a new flexible hall that is at the core of the building, another courtyard, a space for that's divisible by 3 for 3 classrooms, a multiplex auditorium, a kind of space where everything happens, and bringing this all together in a way that negotiates its relationship between the square at the center of this circle and the geometry of the roundabout as a huge urban phenomenon. Now, what's important is that Toronto is a series of north-south axes with a few unique urban spaces, circular nature, and this is one of those spectacular spaces. It's a space not just of the campus, but of the city. The existing building looms large and is visible all the way from the lake, but in fact has never had a northern presence. So our strategy in great part has to do with creating a base, a socle for that, producing a series of landscapes around it that can give additions in the future, and making the landscape a kind of buffer for the new building, and then using that to illuminate those spaces within that landscape and create a new condition for the urban perimeter of this project as a whole. In essence, completing the circle, urbanizing the circle, and giving it new life. Of course, the building comes with certain constraints. A water easement that does not permit us to occupy the east side, but it becomes a way of developing a logic for its flexibility and its expansion, with the possibility of an expansion into a gallery in the first phase, the expansion of a smaller lab lab, a kind of urban institute, a research institute, all of which work off of the logic of the existing corner anchors that are part of a kind of latent logic of the building. All of this recognizing that the strength of this project is known on the north and south axis, an important moment of acknowledgement in the building, and something that really is reinforced by the stature and the presence of the building, but without ever a program to that south. So with the addition of a new terrace, in the cold climate of Toronto, the idea of a new public space that leaks out of the building towards the Spadina south, this was also a moment to recognize that the practical functioning of the building doesn't happen on the north-south axis, but the east-west. The campus is on one side, the community is on the other side, and the street that runs through this building is really what gives life to it. And all of the key programs of, the shop, the auditorium, the cafe, and all of this business happens right off of the street. Again, 24 hours 7 remains open. So with the new facade on the north, as one navigates around this new crystalline landscape on the perimeter of the building, we are drawn into the west face of this building with this new silhouette that it gains. On the eastern side, we in fact open up a new public space, a bleachered seating facing south, the characteristic oak tree, which is part of the symbol of UT Toronto, and the gallery space that literally opens up onto the eastern face. The street then is lined with lockers and with a kind of series of forced perspectives, that the most prominent of which is the view up Spadina North, bringing natural light into the core of this building. This large vitrine on the left then brings in light even into the auditorium. What is at the core of this building has an optical advantage to the spaces beyond, but also in section produces the possibility of drawing in light not only through the Fab Lab into the auditorium, but also from the skylights above here, and a series of straddle spaces that create out of that core a kind of luminous box on the interior. In fact, what would be in another project the black box, the kind of pit of this project, has all of the main programs straddled around it in this saddlebag fashion. The undergraduate lounge, key crit spaces, a social space of bleachers and crit space, and all of the studios going around it. This auditorium would then be opened up on all sides into a theater of performance, if you like. With blackout screens, of course, but then usually quite open so that the activities of what's going on in there are always visible. When lectures get filled with the kind of star lectures, they actually leak out into these very spaces and have a kind of social and performative connectivity between one side and the other. Connecting then from the studio spaces above, the light is also able to, of course, penetrate these civic openings, connecting what is like a bleachered space with a large flat space. This space is then divisible into many types of spaces. 3 classrooms, symposia that are centralized, multi-directional spaces. Essentially, what was a program that was for 500 people is now being expanded to 1,500 people, incorporating a much larger undergraduate experience. Again, like many other programs, the issue of security is always a question. So while all of these are strategies for publicizing the building, the actual entry to the upper studios is a controlled moment off the street. As one ascends, one engages in a kind of promenade that is part of that civic space that eventually ends onto the northern face, reconnecting to Spadina North with, of course, the face of Spadina, this northern wall, a kind of beacon, gaining all of the solar conditions of indirect light from the north. The functions of the studio are quite flexible, and I won't go into the kind of the ins and outs of how the program works, but let it simply be said that flexibility is not merely about open spaces, it's about the accommodation of the differences of scales that you engage in as you become involved in these vast institutional projects. The scale of the individual in a carol, the scale of a table with 5 people working together, the scale of a classroom, the scale of a lecture hall, and the scale of the school as a single body. The way in which this project then is conceived is really about how one integrates the old and the new together around this core in the center. And all of this culminates in this moment, this spanning moment where all of a sudden the structure stops at the 2nd floor. At the 3rd floor, a kind of further forth structural cantilever spans off of 2 cores and then suspends essentially an oculus on the center. This produces a kind of new tabula rasa that opens the space up for many different types of pedagogy. And part of the strategy here is to bring together in a building, like all of our buildings, I won't go too deeply into this, but every building obviously right now has to deal with issues of ecology and sustainability with a higher purpose. And in buildings where you have a captive audience of students, faculty, and critics, which are much more knowledgeable than you are about a certain topic, the pedagogical and didactic mission of these buildings become all the more purposeful. So this was an opportunity really to embed within a structural system a daylighting strategy and a hydrological strategy where all of the surfaces are purposeful. So this animation that brings together the relationship between the performance of the building and the building as a piece of identity. The embedding of the northern wing into the south, the greening of the roof as a way of mitigating the water drainage, the drawing in of light from the north and a little bit from the south, the repurposing of the court, the extension of the landscape into the adjoining urbanism, minimizing the use of electrical usage at nighttime. Minimizing the need for cars. In fact, the majority of the space is accessible by bike and pedestrians and the public transportation system. And then most importantly, what I was saying before, the idea that we minimize the exposed envelope using a natural ventilation system as well as displacement ventilation through a raised floor system in the ground. The minimization of electrical usage through the lighting. The harvesting of stormwater drainage for the irrigation of the landscape on the outside. And then beginning to see that the silhouette of the building, the facade of the building is literally a register of that harvesting through the development of a new reveal within the facade system that drains all of that water system down, brings it into the main public space, contains it within the system, and then redistributes that into the landscape. If you like, this is a building that is robust typologically in its autonomy, but at the same time, it is a piece of landscape architecture. And in many ways, that is what we were faced with in dealing with a new building in southern France. We had the opportunity to advance a dialogue with two great villas from the 1970s or 80s of my professors. One which is composed of biaxial symmetry on the right-hand side, but whose main orientation works off of the oblique. And the other one on the left, by Silvetti, is a project that is centrifugal. In fact, its center is there to anchor only a centrifugal action of ascending stairs on the edge. We had the possibility of developing a courtyard building which is on the side of a hill. The displacement of the volume in relationship to that landscape produces the possibility of connecting the house to itself on two diagonals with these stairs at the corners, while the entry and the family room, these are two different floors superimposed on each other on the opposite obliques. The terracing function of this structure produces a scenario whereby the main living areas are engaged with a courtyard and a pool on one level, but with the majority of the bedrooms underneath looking back into that pool. The nesting of these two volumes brings together the logic of a building whose geometry is a parallelogram with essentially the living spaces and kitchen up in the upper bar and the master suite in the lateral bar, a swimming pool wedged in between. And then below, a series of bedrooms which are then disassociated from the bathroom facilities, effectively making 7 rooms occupiable by 22 people that then use these bathrooms in a kind of dormitory fashion. The circumstances of this project are fantastic, with families coming from the US, from Europe, and the Middle East, all converging on this vacation home together at a critical moment during the summer where the family can get to reconstitute itself. Now, the entry of this building then is quite closed. You are barring the view precisely because at the moment of that threshold, for the first time, you get to see the splendor of the Mediterranean as it opens itself up in the horizon in relationship to you. The organization of this modern extrusion, if you like, is all about the construction of that horizon. But for the client, we developed the idea that that is not your only commodity. There's more to this. If you begin to reconceptualize the space, towards the west, there are beautiful spaces of evergreen pines And if you begin to think of the roof as a structural system that vaults not the short direction, but the long direction of the building, you begin to incorporate the landscape in a direction where you thought there was no value. And thus the building, in many ways, is about the relationship between the construction of a panorama on one side and distinct and valuable frames of views on the opposing side. The crust, the shell of this roofscape is really about a kind of dedication to the natural heritage on the western portion of the site and an engagement, an extension of that landscape to the west. The building then comes together as a kind of exercise in typology. Not a square plot, but a kind of trapezoidal plot produces distortions in the plan that radicalize the panorama on one side, but individuate punched views on the other side. What would have been an internalized building becomes decked in two levels, acknowledging that landscape as it dips down and looks over another wing. A new landscape is constructed on the roof of the building, not only for the hydrological systems, but the framing of views. And then most extraordinarily, the lapping of these two wings produces a new landscape that literally is embedded and extends the groundscape of one side of the building up into the internal courtyard. So even though the front door is formalized in the upper wing, there's a kind of natural loop that runs through the building and into the landscape below. What is beautiful about the building is that being in southern France, there are vineyards, there are fig trees, there are citrus trees. It is really a beautiful landscape to be beholden. Now, what you see here as a front facade effectively is a massive concrete beam that is cantilevered, suspended by one stair on the deep end, and essentially an anchor point on the other end. It's one beam penetrated and connected to the retaining wall of the swimming pool that holds it aloft. And so the wall that you see on the right-hand side of the swimming pool is coming up at a lower level, penetrating the master bedroom, and effectively holding up that wing as not just a structural exercise, but a moment in which, as I say, the structure catalyzes this type to become something completely different in the context of a piece of, not type, but a piece of landscape. Now this wall is then further elaborated with a kind of corridor space that begins to programmatically expand the relationship between the inside and the outside, taking the outside landscape into the bedrooms and then into the depth of the corridors, and then taking the program of these bedrooms, essentially the tile, the terracotta from one side and the bathroom tile on the other side, we begin to populate the corridors with these two competing iconographies, where on one side the bedrooms invade the corridor, on the other side the tile of the swimming pool leaks into the bathrooms and then subsequently into the corridors themselves. Here from the shower, the sink, a mirror, and then the view into the swimming pool. Now, a slight detour. As you know, we're interested in the advent of construction. And this is the first building that we've done in concrete, and it's a radical departure from the studies of aggregation that we've done over the last 20 years. In other words, what happens when you can't build anymore with modules? And now with the advent of digital fabrication, you can essentially build anything you want, which escapes the tyranny of the relationship of the human body to a unit of construction that you have to put in place. Many years ago, when I was in RISD with Juanit, I went to the Rome program and I had no idea why Roman streets were built in this arched fashion that they are. And it becomes quite logical when you realize that somebody has to rest their knees on the ground, and the arch of the stone is the reach of the arm as they put each of these cobblestones in place. That, in fact, is not very different than many other ways in which we fabricated and indexed the world. Even graffiti art is very much the result of a kind of relationship with the body. What digital fabrication does, once and for all, if you end up printing a building out, just the same way we do models, is it basically kills that relationship, and the media becomes something completely different. This is something that has theoretically scandalized me for some years now, and becomes a kind of parallel project that I'm trying to develop as we go forward. But in the context of this building, it really is about how you begin to index a medium that is initially liquid, that then becomes indexed in a solid and massive piece. Recognizing that concrete is the result more of the formwork at work than in the aggregation of aggregates at any given time. So on the left side, you see the slats of wood as they become indexed on one side. In the right-hand side with Rudolph, the kind of post-production of bush hammering. But even much more interesting historical figures in Spain on the left and Andrew Cudlis on the right, the idea of fabric formwork means that there's, in fact, a great range of expression that is available to the medium of the pour, to the liquid medium. And so, as an exercise, we did two very different types of studies that this house could encounter with, probably at the same time. One being digital on one side, the idea that the mechanism for representation and expression is completely divorced from the way it's fabricated. We can make a formwork that can make it look like anything we want to, and on the other hand, working literally with the aggregate content of that wall to begin to develop its expression. So first, the notion that out of the silence of a poured wall, one can develop different digital formworks that you can readjust, showing the way in which a smooth wall can become rusticated as you begin to go into the depths of the entrance area. And this displays essentially the absolute arbitrary relationship between the signifier and the signified. You can make it anything you want. The other one is more difficult and probably much more expensive, but is worth the kind of speculation. The notion that the smooth walls of the interior become engaged in larger chunks of aggregate as they get cast into the retaining walls of the landscape and effectively become large stone walls as they go off into the landscape and begin to structure the experience of the landscape at large within the property and beyond, a kind of characteristic feature of southern France altogether. The idea that the material conditions of this building are at once in address of its structural conditions and the larger landscape arena within which they're a part of was very important for us. I mean, on the one hand, the site is suburban, let's face it. And on the other hand, it is nested in a bosque of trees that makes it almost invisible to the rest of the houses around it and completely protected, and becomes a kind of exercise on horticulture and the extension of different types of trees, different types of plantings, wine, grapes, figs, citrus fruits, and becomes part of a promenade that holds the entire landscape together through a sequence of courtyards and, of course, retaining walls and that begin to invade and occupy the land in its full potential. Now, in thinking through problems of structure, and this is the last problem, we're reminded that structure is not only a discipline that holds up buildings. It's not just actual. in the context of the definition of tectonics, structure is always engaged in a phenomena of expression and visual performance, such as we know happens in the enthesis of a classical column. And we've witnessed this in different forms of aggregate construction. In my own context from Iran, there's a vast difference from the Seljuk period, the Safavid period, and the Qajar period, whereby the integration of brick construction on the one hand is embedded within the logic of the structural wall, or in the Safavid period where the structural integrity of a veneer is independent of the core of the wall and yet sustains itself. And by the time you get to the Qajar period, the tile has its own autonomy as a kind of appliqué, a veneer, a skin that is laid on top of it, but actually has its own structural motivations internal to the skin itself. And that is as much a legitimate challenge for working with the kind of problems and the potentials that we have. So quickly going through this, you begin to see the way in which these different epochs and these different periods develop over time in relationship to each other, exposing the relationship between structure and skin, core and iconography, and the idea of the skin as a tiling system that is overlaid and almost autonomous of the enterprise that supports it. And all of these projects, those that have absolute structural core as their expression, and those which are clad in some way or other, have a relationship with this phenomenon. And so for the final project, we were thrown into a site next to the presidential mountain range up in New Hampshire, where we had one of the most sublime relationships to a beautiful mountain range, which became the object of speculation for the building. The building becomes a kind of viewing machine that essentially enjoys, obsesses, and gets organized by this entire system of ranges. And the only way to do that was to torque the plan, essentially, around those things so that each room, in a way, becomes aligned not on axis, but in a kind of ring to engage the very natural phenomena, the natural heritage around it. In doing so, it produces a series of generic boxes with residual spaces in between. Those residual spaces become decks and external rooms for the building, the most prominent of which is the entry space that brings in a kind of deepened threshold that brings you into the most prominent court in the center, as well as a porch that extends through the building. The device of structuring this building is really the generic New England box, and here with the framed view. Most importantly, this translates to the outside with spaces that penetrate from the kind of wild landscape to the more contained landscape of the courts on the inside, making a kind of indoor-outdoor room. And then the structuring of the landscape in a series of oval spaces that mediate, let's say, the savage nature of the area, which we're trying to maintain with a more domesticated court on the interior. And admittedly, of course, one gets here by the car and is embedded into the core of the building, underneath it, in fact, into the central court in its center, and then ascends up through two stairs, either a kind of dirty stair or a clean stair. But then the argument of the building is embedded really in the plan. The plan is a kind of obsession. The genericness of the box in a kind of constant negotiation through its knuckles, ligaments, and joinery, negotiating the moments of connection. With the inner liner being a kind of circulatory zone, and the outside being the frame that looks out. The service spaces being the back, one room suite, another room suite, living room suite, and a master suite. On this side, essentially, each of them have a world that looks outside, and then all brought together by the main gate, a threshold that connects the inner court to the driveway and oval court to on the eastern side. Now, importantly, what brings this all together, much like the Saint-Tropez house, is that this vault is constructed through and thought through a staircase system that begins to ascend from the service area and onto the roof. As you go up, the staircase ascends into the crust of the roof, producing the possibility of an open archway that creates the deepened threshold that enters into the building. The drop-off happens there, and into that core you get the light from the courtyard, but also the deepened threshold of the entryway on the left-hand side. The staircase is then somehow registered into the deck that you see on the right-hand side. A kind of cavernous space, a protected space from what is this ostensibly a harsh winter. I keep thinking that a bear could actually live in here very happily. And finally, all of this comes together in a kind of central court that is controlled, domesticated, even heated possibly, as the one place of repose from the harsh winds of both the summer and the winter months. And essentially even has a pylon for the trees in the center as it gets anchored, and structures a different kind of experience that is isolated from within the interior. Now, these volumes are then clad together, going back to the question of tectonics, with a kind of vertical cedar system that wraps each of these volumes as a dump system, comes back into the courtyard, goes back around, and again, as a ruled surface, wraps around. What is a wall becomes a ceiling, frames the view in that key and most important space, which is an outdoor room. In fact, in the wintertime, the glazing is drawn here and closes it off. But in the summer, the glazing is drawn back, screens are put in perpendicular, and the inside and the outside are brought together in a kind of complete synthesis and sort of bring together the potentials of this landscape. Now, at the core of this argument, putting issues of structure aside, has something to do with two pedigrees of architectural planning that I am completely fascinated by. One of them is, the legacy that was left behind by Louis Kahn and the way in which different types, even Sterling does this, as you know, in Berlin, where different building types are brought together in collision, if you like, in a collage level, and that these junctions of these two produce unexpected perspectival and promenadal conditions. This is very different than the techniques adopted by Hugo Herring and Hans Scharoun, where vestiges of those types remain intact, but then are brought together, fused together by a technique that, if you like, is much more organic and much more binding. And this project is trying to maintain the self-consciousness of the former, but radicalize the latter in a series of spaces that are not just at the periphery, because those are the kind of literal pleasures of the view, but some of the more sophisticated spaces really happen along the promenade in this core, where both the courtyard and the rooms and the kind of tectonics that brings us all together is brought into evidence. The tectonic system then is quite simple, but important to argue for, a kind of rumination of the relationship between the part and the whole of the building. The cladding system is not merely a veneer, it's a system that has depth to it in the context of the louvers. It has depth to it in the context of the doors and a board and batten system that gives depth to concealed doors. It has the possibility of programming itself by producing storage depths. And in the context of the fins that give autonomy and privacy to each of the decks, is scalable. And not only is it a slat of wood, but that slat of wood develops into dimensions that begin to impact morphologically and structurally the building, because in fact the drainage system and the structural system are embedded in these wedges, which are a kind of objectification of those cones of view as they go out. Naturally, this is also a reflection on the difference between the vertical and the horizontal, knowing that the winter will bring a completely different extension as the floor and roof laminate get extended one more time into the depths of the snow. Now, as I've already exceeded my time, I apologize. I wanted to end with really just 3 slides that bring the question of typology on the one hand and structural systems on the other, and try to argue for a way of working that brings 2 historical trajectories together. 2 trajectories that rarely are brought together by either historians on the one hand, nor architects who take positions in one extreme or the other. We are constantly engaged with an architecture, let's say an architecture of classicism, that is organic, that is an architecture that is beholden to the relationship or the commitment of constructing a meaningful rapport between the part and the whole. What you're looking at here is Santa Maria de Apache. It's a great moment in that thinking, whereby the syntax of structure, actual and representative, is brought together, but in a very humorous and negligent moment, when the classical order is swallowed and engulfed in that corner, because it was not thought through in terms of the full yield of the width of a pilaster. And only, we had to wait till Palladio, from Bramante to Palladio, to realize that that pilaster needed to be offset 1 bay in order that you turn the corner with 2 columns, not 1, because the one precisely gets engulfed. That structure is as much representational as actual, is part and parcel of this argument. Completely on the other end of the spectrum is a kind of modality represented by people like Gaudi, where architecture is no less expressive, but is really the result of a kind of understanding of performance and the willing to risk of speculation. Really looking at phenomena and saying, how does the world work, and willing to fail, the willingness to test things to failure. And much of our work is really the result of tinkering, and that has lasted us for at least these 30 years by simply committing to play and play more. It's very, very few instances where designers, engineers, architects bring these 2 modalities, these sensibilities together. And I find very few instances historically, but Dieste is maybe the one person that blurs the line between where great architecture, great engineering, great inventions are brought together into a kind of critical synthesis, whereby the disciplines are expanded with full force. If we can, if only contribute at a minor level to that modality, that would be my goal in the next 10 years. Thank you very much.
You may have some questions. Hal?
Just an observation and a question. The observation is if your work is, as you said, premised on this idea of a lack of structural education or not being able to pass the structural exam, I would say mission accomplished. anybody who mentions DS Day and Firth before in the same lecture, they ought to just give you the structure exam, I think. The question is, the structural examinations are so compelling, particularly the animations, but they kind of hint at some further possibilities, particularly this idea of dynamic characteristics. And to go from the general to the specific, have you thought about dynamic possibilities, and in particular at Georgia Tech, this idea of movement with the crane? Could the crane have kept being operational to allow for vertical and horizontal movement?
I think anything is possible with the right budget. And you know, there are a range of people who actually are dealing with kinetic structures. I forget his name, Chuck Hoberman, among others, who are dealing with smart geometries, smart materials, and I think that it's just incredible. We always talked about if we could, you know, literally get that crane to move back and forth. But the constraints under which that project were designed were so exorbitant that it remained a joke, both with the facilities people and the faculty and us throughout that time. But it was an important joke, and it underlines really the importance of your question. The notion that latency can produce extraordinary conditions in architecture. If you think of the, you know, Casa Girasole that literally rotates with the advent of the sun. If you think of other buildings like the Schroeder House that, you know, reinvents the type by essentially unhinging itself off of the 4 panels that open up. All of these are moments in which not just structure, but kinetics begins to re-envision how we think of space, how we think of time, and how we think of structure. So, I think that, well, now a kind of a nod to the animation. Yes, the animations demonstrate things through time. And we've used them in a kind of instrumental way to sometimes show experience, how you move through space, sometimes show the evolution of ideas from a morphological condition to a cladding condition to an experiential condition. But essentially they have a didactic function. They are a kind of vignette that exposes the ideas of the project in a sound bite, in a visual bite. And yes, that too could become the precondition for a dynamic condition, which is in fact what, you know, Hoberman does. To do justice to your question, we have not achieved that. We have not, in a way, made that our first priority, but part of this has to do with the kind of moment in our practice, I would say. That you're looking, in fact, at a very young practice. Until 3 years ago, we were still tinkering with, despite my age, tinkering with installations, small projects, and so forth. And these are all, except for 2 projects, one for a big corporation in New York and one for a very wealthy family in Massachusetts, the majority of our commissions have been really in the most difficult financial circumstances, either because of the result of economic breakdowns or because of very just strict budgets. So we haven't had that kind of luxury to speculate in a realistic way on the possibilities that you offer. But it's very much part of my desire and my fascination, and certainly when we were doing the MoMA exhibit, this is now in the 90s, in fact right after that it was the Hoberman thing that happened at MoMA, and that, you know, I was absolutely captivated by it, and it remains a kind of desire to be able to translate some of our fascination with geometry and kinetics into something that is meaningful. The question is also a question of economy, like what are you willing to do for what project and for what reason? My critique of the Media Lab is not an organizational one. It is organized in a great way, and it could have become a great school of architecture, actually. It's At what cost do you do that, and for what purpose? The Media Lab would have been an amazing building of Maki's had he spent, $10 million less. I'm arguing. So I want to find the right conditions to be able to address the latent potential that you put on the table, but in a critical way.
Yes.
How do you prioritize your objectives when you aren't stuck with a real constrained budget? And is there a certain process that you go through?
In one sense, we are very conventional architects, if I can say in a non-polemical way. We are working with clients, we're working with the facilities groups, we're working with focus groups, we're dealing with programmatic conditions under very, very strict conditions. So issues like program and function, which I really didn't present today, are upfront and central as one aspect of the building, but upfront. Usually, if in other offices I've seen that the organizational aspects of design are done first, and then the material aspects are dealt with later, at the end of SD or a DD or something like that, we don't do that. We are developing the technologies of the building, its structural systems, its mechanical systems, its material systems, sometimes before we even know how the building works. So in that sense, to be also candid about it, often we're working on 3 or 4 projects which are not even real. They're just material systems that we are readapting for this or that project, because the only way to try to be inventive or try to engage the building industry is to already have worked with what they know how to do, but to be able to tweak them in one or the other direction. So working with constraints is really part of the game also. We're not really inventing things from scratch. We are not one of those architects that have recomposed architecture from a nano scale. We're not recomposing the cell. I wish I were that kind of architect, by the way. And there are great people doing that kind of research. Unfortunately, I don't have the knowledge base for that, but as an extension of our concerns, you can imagine I would like to do that. But part of that has to do with a clear understanding of the physics of materials, pure behavior of the materials, but also the building industry. It's the trades, the sub-trades, the unions and all of that, because the protocols of construction are so much what eat away at architecture that if you're innocent of that, forget about it. You're dead. So part of, let's say, our ability to do a little bit of what we're doing has been to acknowledge that the design process is chaotic, things change, you have to embrace uncertainty, but put all of the things, all of the different conflicts in the mix from day one. The moment of reconciliation is an important one. And if you don't have a building budgeted and put together in DD, forget about it again, because you're not going to do it in CD. CD is merely a kind of consolidation and a kind of stamping of those things that have been proved before that time. So I'm saying if you snooze through SD, you've lost the project in my mind, or you've lost the possibility of invention. So part of this is essentially prioritizing what you want to control and what you don't want to control. Some laments. My lament in Melbourne is that we were unable to have a square footage that produced really innovative studio spaces, and such that the thickening of the atrium space is that space. Will it be great? I hope so. Can I guarantee it? I don't know. You have to let buildings be taken over before you know that. But we do know that in a way that all of that happened right up front. So it's really important to understand, let's say, the politics of production in order to be able to design. If you don't know that, and if you don't know what you want to control, like the means and methods of fabrication, then you don't know who's putting a budget on it. Because the majority of what you can't do is because the builder is telling you you can't do it, not because you can't do it. And because they have the final say on budget. If you had the final say on budget, and you got to determine the profits, you would be able to do a lot more than you're able to do. And in many ways, you know, people like Gary, whose architecture is neither here nor there from a kind of discipline point of view, he unleashed a whole new potential in the kind of metal cladding system because of his ability to absorb it as part of his responsibilities and redeploy the shop drawings under his roof. And that you have to give credit to, because at that point you're not talking about the morphology of these buildings. It's the ability to legally absorb it under his banner. And I think a lot of what we've done at the Mickey Mouse level is to build up that ammunition a little bit from a kind of digital manufacturing access point of view, you know, a little bit of it from just a kind of smart collaboration with people in the industry, and some of it by just understanding how quantities matter.
I think we could continue this conversation for a very long time, and I'd like to invite everybody to the reception and to the opening. Nader, Tehrani will be there, able to continue the conversation, answer questions